Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here, in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Jake Friedman.
I'm Brendan Hansen.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
And in today's episode, we're getting to work. Actually, we're talking about play at work, which is not the same as working at work, but it's kind of like work at work if you want to be in a playful mindset and it's at the right time. I think at least we're going to get to the bottom of that and more in this episode where we explore games at work, that whole topic.
Yeah, exactly. So it's going to be framed around an actual presentation that I'm giving at work that I'll talk about. And then in the back half of the episode, we'll talk a little bit about our experience with playing games at work, maybe the type of games that you'd want to bring out to for folks and get into that a little bit as well. So it should be a really fun episode.
Before we get into it, we periodically like to, and by that I mean at least once before, we've done updates on past episodes based on the feedback that we received from the community after them. And we recently recorded an episode on sweet spot mechanisms in games, and someone brought up this really great idea, which is that Dominion is also a sweet spot mechanism. And I thought that this was such a wonderful counterpoint in some ways to what the way that we had framed sweet spot mechanisms as on that episode, talking about things like blackjack or we talked about lots of different examples, but a lot of them were about sort of hitting these score ranges that were discrete and clearly defined. And Dominion, and I think this comment was specifically about the victory point mechanism where you're shuffling victory point cards in your deck and those don't do anything except to give you victory points. So you have to time it perfectly. And I just thought that that was a great example of another way in which you can add sweet spots to a game where it's not clearly defined, but does have a clear-ish consequence. You lose if you don't do it right. And you're trying to think about sort of everyone else's timing puzzle in the game. So that's just more food for thought. If you listen to the sweet spot episode, that gives you another way to think about that same question. If not, you should go listen to that episode because it's a good one.
It's really exciting when some of the episodes take on a second life after we record, and people will be in our Discord talking about a specific episode in a specific episode thread for weeks afterwards. And that was the case with the sweet spot episode, which kind of clues us into, even if maybe people didn't agree with what we said on the show, but there's definitely something interesting there to continue thinking about and learning about. So always appreciate people going in our Discord and sharing their thoughts on any episode.
Yeah. And then speaking of our Discord, Jake, we don't often take a little bit of space at the top of the episode to talk about our Patreon. And I feel like we need to do it every once in a while. If we never ask, people will never go and check it out. So here we are. It's the work episode. Work is where you do things for money, right? So I'm just going to talk about it real quickly. We have a Patreon. If you like what we do and you want to support it in some way, we would love for you to do that. You can go to decisionspace.com/Patreon. To learn more about it. And essentially you'll get a live video recording that Jake and I do of the show where it is an unedited version of the podcast, usually in advance, sometimes days in advance, sometimes a different week in advance, though not very often.
Always at least the night before.
Always at least the night before. That's this type of early access that you're welcome to. There's also a Discord channel specifically for patrons where a lot of pre-discussion of episodes will typically take place. So if you like sort of hearing about the context in which our shows typically come together, we'll use our Patreon-only Discord channel at the bridge to bounce ideas off people.
Very often an idea for the episode will come out of that channel. I really think about our patron supporters on Patreon as producers of this show, and we really take seriously the insight that these fans of Decision Space, friends of ours now, have to say about this show. So if that appeals to you at all, please check out our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/decisionspace or decisionspacepodcast.com/Patreon. Give it a look. We'll probably revamp it at some point soon, but we're really asking for $1 or $2 a month. Goes a long way, even if that money of any amount really is wind in the sails of this show. So thank you so much for considering supporting our podcast.
If everyone who listened to this show gave $1, it would completely transform our ability to make Decision Space something even more incredible. So yeah, that's just food for thought. But anyway, let's get to work, Jake. Let's get to work.
Getting into our topic today, play at work. And the reason I proposed this episode topic to Brendan is because it's something that's impacting my actual life, actual real job. You may be surprised to know that despite our generous Patreon supporters, that is Brendan and I still have to work professional jobs. This is unfortunately very much a hobby for fun for us. Maybe someday it will elevate to become a side hustle. And then from there, who knows? But right now, just a for fun hobby. So I do work for a living. I am a strategist at a foundation, so a grant making organization. And one thing we do is convene annually an advocates retreat in our state where we invite advocates from all different fields to come gather, learn from each other, do sessions, etc. And last year, I proposed a session to our organizing committee that I could do a session talking about play at work and why I think play is an essential component to performing well in not just our job in philanthropy or in advocacy, but I truly and genuinely believe that being playful at work, having a playful mindset is an asset to any profession, any field, truly any job that one might have. So they took me up on my offer. I did the session and it went well. People wrote really kind things, gave good positive reviews, so much so that they invited me back this year. So it's coming up in a couple of weeks as we're recording this. And they even put me in a much bigger room. So I'll have, instead of 40 people, it'll be like 85 or 100. So that's super exciting. I'm really looking forward to giving the session. And I thought maybe I could share some of the ideas on the session on this podcast for our audience who might be interested, and even to kind of bounce some ideas off Brendan to perhaps improve the presentation before I give it in a couple of weeks.
So this is awesome, Jake. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm glad you've doubled your audience. That's amazing. And you're obviously used to speaking of audiences much larger than that, just based on this podcast. So it's going to go
Right.
great.
That's right.
But I do. I sounded sarcastic or maybe sardonic, but I was kind of not being. With regards to the sort of parameters, you've kind of labeled the episode "Play at Work." Are you primarily in this talk talking about games, or are you talking about different types of play at work too? For example, maybe, I don't know. There's lots of types of play. Like if you had a bake-off, would that count?
That is an interesting case. I would think that a bake-off of basically anything that is fun and not work that you're doing on the clock qualifies. Bringing in baked goods from home and then, spending your 15 minutes of your lunch hour trying and rating them, in my mind, wouldn't qualify. Because that's like you using your free time to do something extra,
Sure.
right?
Okay. Yeah.
Having a softball team with your work colleagues would not qualify as play at work, though it might be a credit to like a healthy
Sure.
work culture that
Got
people
it.
are organizing in extracurricular ways.
Talking specifically
like
about playing in the workspace
Yeah.
during work hours.
In the context of the presentation I'm giving, I talk a lot about board games because that's what I know and can share examples of, but definitely encouraging things like, playing video games. If you had video games set up in like a communal break room, foosball, whatever, any kind of playfulness, any kind of game, a tetherball pole outside in the courtyard, that would work too. So this is not like exclusively saying play board games at work to improve your work life and work output. It's saying play, period. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions before I kind of like dive into some of the content of the presentation?
I think I want you dive, and
Okay.
I'll hold my questions to see if they're answered, and if not, then I'll chime in.
Okay. On my other screen here, as we're recording, I've got my PowerPoint slides. So I'm just kind of looking through it.
Cool.
Basically, my credentials for giving this talk is that I have a podcast called Decision Space. So I shout that out. And last year, it absolutely killed my one of the biggest laughs I got was when I revealed that we had won a Golden Geek Award, just because that sounds so ridiculous to a layman. Yeah. And now I have on that slide 2 Golden Geeks that are going to kind of appear on click.
Amazing.
What I'm trying to do in the presentation is essentially make the case play is an
Yeah.
important part of doing our job well. Because as I said, I fundamentally believe, that we're performing best, whether, you're an athlete competing on a team or, you're part of a work team. If people are having fun, you're likely to do a better job at whatever you're doing. Oh, and I also want to just give one caveat up front at this. There is a small cohort of people who do not like our quasi-scientific approach as we as we define terms on the podcast. This is fully quasi-scientific, right? This is largely anecdotal. There's
Mm.
some scholarly research in this field that I've cited it and I can talk a little bit about, but a lot of that is like it's things that I've experienced in my life, in my job, when I'm played on competitive sports teams. You see the stories in the articles every year about the NBA teams who are like clapping hands and slapping each other's butts the most often are also the teams performing well.
Or the stories about all of them playing Catan.
Exactly. Yeah, that is a great one to bring up.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that is a lot of where this idea is coming from. Like, that brought me to this topic to do a bit more research and dive into it. So, I'm trying to share that kind of insight that I feel like I've gleaned with other people. And so, I start off by sort of polling the room about what associations people have coming into the session. And this comes right out of CT Wynn's book, Games Agency as Art, where,
Yeah.
he speaks in that book about, having difficulty getting people to take his work seriously because people often associate play and games as sort of
Frivolous.
childish pursuits, right?
Yeah.
Or they might think waste of time or, low priority, etc. So I'm expecting that is the type of audience that will be receiving this content. So I want to give them a new language to think about games. And I'm using CT Wynn's book, Games Agency as Art, and his definition of games are agency as art to give them terms that they can substitute when
Mm.
they're talking with a boss or a colleague,
Yeah.
as a way that they can start thinking about games in a way that are a little bit more serious, a little bit more worthy of consideration than, what their first gut reaction is to, hey, we should go play a game right now, right? If somebody came up to you and said that to you in the middle of work, a lot of people would be like, hell no, I'm working right now. I
Yeah.
can't go play a game.
Yeah.
Why are you able to do that in your job?
Sure. And in some ways, right, like the magic circle of playing a game, if we're going to expand that term that we use on this podcast a lot to talk about a social contract within a space of playing games, there's also a magic circle at work. But it's a very different type of magic circle. And it's that when we're at work, we're working, right? Like there's all of these new social norms that we take on based on the organization that we work at that you have to intuit in the same way that you kind of just intuit them based on playing games for a long time and habituate what that type of magic circle is at. And in some ways, I will say, in my experience, those are pretty at odds with each other outside of maybe a very special workplace.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think it's a great way of sort of putting it where when you're sitting at your desk at work, it feels like maybe nobody has explicitly told you don't play games on your computer at work, but you kind of intuit that based on the behaviors of everybody else
Yeah.
around you.
Uh,
Right. So if we're saying, hey, that's actually something that is not only appropriate for you to do, it's actually might be helpful for our team to do our job best if you take 15 minutes out of an hour to do something that's going to like relax you, put you in a happy state of mind. It takes, a specific intervention. It's not something that would just naturally occur within an existing magic circle. So in order to kind of begin that, I use borrow a lot from Games Agency as Art, and I want to talk to people a little bit about the different types of play that can exist. So I share achievement play and striving play, those definitions. Which, if you're interested in this topic, we previously recorded with the author of the book Games Agency as Art, Dr. CT Wynn. I think it's episode 67. It's one I often
yeah.
recommend to people. So we'll talk a lot more about what those are there. But if you haven't listened to that episode, you have no idea what I'm talking about. The very, very short definition is achievement play is playing for the sake of winning. These are the professional athletes of the world or the professional poker players whose only objective is to win because that's their job to win. That's how they make money. And striving play is where you're playing for the sake of going through the struggle to win. That's what we do when we gather around and play board games. That's the type of play that I'm advocating for in the work setting. It wouldn't really make sense to introduce a game where people must win in order to have a desirable outcome of that play. So once I've kind of laid that groundwork and I go through a few examples of those type of things, then I get into a bit of the meat of the presentation where I make the case, right? Why do I think play is so helpful? And there are really two aspects of this. And the first is that play is good for mental and physical health. Is that something that you just agree with, Brendan, off the cuff, or do you need some convincing?
I mean, do I agree with it? Yes, I
Yeah,
agree. I agree almost wholesale. I mean, it's hard to speak in absolutes, right? There's definitely ways in which you can play games that aren't healthy, but I think in moderation, games, right? Like I have played games in a way that has not been healthy for my life, but the vast majority of my game playing has been absolutely wonderful for my life and
right.
makes my life way better. So yes, I agree. But actually, could you just give me some? Is there any?
Yeah, no, I mean, I was genuinely curious to what you thought about that because I know you value games and think they're important to being like a well-rounded person, but there is a leap from that to saying like, no, it's actually going to make you healthier to play
Yeah.
games, which is what I genuinely believe. So this is actually, well, I'll share some of the things I found, and then I can share a personal anecdote that I don't know that I've shared on this podcast before. So this is like going through Google Scholar, typing in like health and play, et cetera, and just some of the interesting things that I found. There's an interesting study that demonstrated Wii bowling specifically was incredibly impactful in combating loneliness in um, retirement communities. A lot of studies talking about play as a way to alleviate daily stress, and then a lot about playfulness as a trait. Like the people who are playful, or however that's defined within the study, that being playful as a trait is strongly tied just to general life satisfaction and having an active, and also positively associated with having an active way of life, which is positively associated with physical fitness. There's a lot in the aging research about play being beneficial to working memory, task shifting reaction time, and processing speed. There's pieces about relief from stress and anxiety, a way of coping with physical pain and mental pain or depression, and kind of growing research demonstrating that games can be efficacious for older adults suffering from degenerative cognitive diseases. So there are real academic research that show generally there are real health benefits to play, at least for certain subsections of the population, especially it seems like in the uh, older adults, aging community. Play is particularly important for those folks.
Nice. I think that this is a topic too where I feel like so much scholarship gets done on sort of the pernicious effects of games, at least coming out of in our lifetimes, right? There's like a lot of, I don't know, we don't need to delve too far into this, but I think that this is an area where I'm really excited to see where the scholarship ends up in 50 or 60 or 70 years. And I think that in some ways it's tough to look at a lot of game playing is a pretty specific habit that I think the effects of it are probably lasting, and but you need sort of like a longitudinal study. I want to know how playing games for my entire life affects me for the outcome of my life
Yeah,
is what I want to know.
I th-
And yeah, I don't think a
yeah,
lot of those studies exist yet.
and neither of us are PhDs in anything like related to this.
Yeah,
So this is just as
this is
I'm
true.
able to understand things. But one thing that I do believe is that loneliness in particular
Yeah.
is a big problem,
Yeah.
especially for older adults, but really for anyone. And, a gaming group, whether that's Wii Bowling or getting together for a board game with folks, or even like logging on to Board Game Arena and chatting with people online while you're playing, could be a good way to alleviate that. And I think loneliness is also something we can experience in the workplace as well. Maybe not as specifically as, in our personal lives, but feeling isolated, right? That can't be good, I think, for doing our work well. And I think that's one place that I see games as like a clear intervention. There were some funny things that I found in this. A lot of people want to know if games are a good learning tool. Can we like
Yeah.
learn and become
Yeah.
smarter by playing games? And research is truly very mixed. I
Yeah.
would have loved to include like, yes, playing games makes you smarter in this presentation, but I don't feel like I can really do that based on what I was able to dig up. There was a particularly funny study on Tetris, where they wanted to see if playing Tetris would improve people's spatial reasoning. Do you know this
I don't
study, or
know
have
the
you seen this?
study. No.
Okay, so it's pretty great. So they had people play Tetris, or pre-test, post-test. Like they tested them on spatial reasoning, then had them play a lot of Tetris. Then they tested them again like weeks later after this like Tetris intervention, and found that people were definitely better at spatial reasoning after the Tetris intervention, but only at things that look like Tetris blocks.
Nice. That makes sense. I do think playing Tetris makes you better at Tetris. So it
That's
makes
exactly
yeah.
basically what they found. It's like, yes,
Yeah.
people did get better at Tetris.
Yeah.
And that's pretty funny. Okay, so that is, I have more on this in the presentation, but like that's basically my case one. It's actually engaging in play is actually good for your physical and mental health, and there's some research that backs up what I kind of have intuitively have come to believe through my own life experiences to be true. Oh, and I was going to share a personal anecdote. Have I talked about my grandfather on this podcast before?
Maybe briefly, but
Maybe briefly, yeah.
yeah.
So my grandfather, who has passed, was a Holocaust survivor and born in Poland. And when he was liberated, he was sent to like essentially an orphanage for liberated young men. And for 2 years, I don't know how long it was. I don't know if it was years or 6 months or what it was. Um, but he spent time at a school with a bunch of people. It was like a boys' school, and the intervention that they had these kids do have just been through the worst experience, really just a horrible experience, right? Horrible trauma. And they just had them play games. They played in the yard, they would play checkers, they would play chess. They could have my grandpa shared that they were allowed to have as much soda as they wanted, but they basically were able just like have a childhood, right? And kind of like play and experience that. And that isn't, I don't want to make any claims on like the effectiveness on that for everybody, but for my grandfather, it seemed to really be what he needed at that time in his life. And went on to have a really incredible life, and kind of credited that with being something that set him up to be a successful person after all of that trauma that he had been through. So I think that also kind of is in the back of my head as I come into this presentation, this topic is like, there is something here, some restorative property, some health benefit of, engaging in play, that I think to be true.
That's really so. I don't know that I had heard that full part of the story of your grandfather, and I think that's so interesting and also so cool and so amazing that he sort of looks back on that time fondly for saying, "This really did effectively help me heal and at least start to heal or whatever." I don't want to put words in your grandfather's mouth,
Right.
but I think Jake too, and just reflecting even beyond health benefits. Did you find any scholarship, or have you thought at all about the social benefits of play? And sort of so is this coming? Should I stop?
Where we're at
Yeah.
now in the presentation, case number 2
Okay.
is social and work related benefits of
Yeah.
play.
Cool.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of going there, but I'm interested to hear what you have to say on this topic, because maybe it's something I can incorporate.
Well, I was just gonna say, I think that for me, one of the things about playing games that's so unique among activities that we do is that there's like total and complete making mistakes is okay in games, right? Like that's just part of the nature of games is that you'll make mistakes probably, and that's just part of playing games and learning
Yeah,
to make mistakes gracefully is part of
that's
that.
where I'm going.
Is it? Okay, great. Then I will pull the
Okay,
car
I
back
don't mean to cut
over.
you off, but
No, 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 no. I'm gonna let you
we're getting
pass
there.
because you're headed somewhere. I'm gonna keep following, and then I'll dive back in. So back to
Okay.
you.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so the second part is about building trust, right? And this is where it is becomes more explicitly about like why is play good, not just generally for us. And to specifically connect the dots, I think that if we're healthy physically and mentally well, that leads into better work in general, right? A better work culture, better for everybody. So that's where part one fits into the workplace. And then the second part is kind of, I think games are a great way to build trust and connect socially as a workplace. Uh, I'll be way shorter here about the kind of scholarly stuff I could find. But one interesting study is like playing a game at work, and this is a really specific thing for people listening to this who are like, I work and I like to play games. If you are a person who facilitates meetings at your work, you should know that playing a game beats the pants off of an icebreaker question for building connection and bonds with people entering a meeting. And it could be a really quick game, right? But spending 5 minutes doing a round of just one is going to do a better job of building connections amongst people in the room than, you know, asking people what their favorite Thanksgiving food is and for everybody to share. It's just much better, according to this scholarly article I found, to actually play games. And there are some really interesting reasons why that we'll talk about in a second. And then there's a lot of other things that are you kind of come up to, right? Like fun at work positively associated with organizational citizenship behavior, task performance, and creative performance, etc. But comes with an enormous caveat in all of this research, which is that it has to be like organic or at least consented to.
Yeah.
If you're forcing people to play at work and they are not like consenting, right? You're the boss and saying, "Hey, everyone, I put this 3-hour meeting on the calendar because I want to play, I don't know, a feast for Odin with you." That is not like, I don't think anyone would do that, but that's not likely to go well. And in fact, if games and fun is not consented to, it actually has the exact opposite effect on a workplace, right? It will make people feel worse, um, than better. So you have to be. It's a really powerful tool. I think that speaks to like the power of this as a tool, but you have to be really careful with it. So that's the first part. Any thoughts on that? On kind of the social and trust based games at work piece?
No, I think that makes complete and total sense. And I also think, even in the context of like of icebreakers, some people just really, really don't like games. Most people
Yeah.
can stomach playing for a few minutes, but I think it even goes so much further to even saying, sort of, we're at, to start off this meeting, we're going to play a short game. If anyone doesn't want to play, that's totally fine. Feel free to sit it out. I think even that would start building trust too,
Right,
right? Like,
100%. Yeah,
yeah,
like you can work on your emails for the next 5 minutes
if
and
yeah,
no sweat.
yeah, totally. Okay,
Yeah, that's a great way of doing it. Okay, and then so kind of under that piece of trust based gaming, and I use the term trust based gaming because trust based philanthropy is like a big buzzword in my particular industry right now. So that's like going to be acute to some folks in this meeting. But essentially, what I'm talking about is the work related benefits of play. Um, and the second part of that piece is that what you were talking about, Brendan, which I think is incredibly important, is that games create spaces to fail and practice new skills.
yeah,
So I was listening to NPR, and this was a story that ran on NPR last year that really made me think of presenting on this topic in the first place. And they were running a story on this a book that was coming out that's called The Perfection Trap, written by Thomas Curran, and he was being interviewed on the NPR story. I haven't actually read the book, which is a little irresponsible since this is the second year I'm talking about the book in a presentation. But in the NPR story, he talks about an experiment that he ran at his lab where they had people, two groups of people come in to his lab. The one group are like self-proclaimed, self-identified perfectionists, or they had tagged them as perfectionists by like whatever the survey was that they had them do at the introduction to this session. And then the other group wasn't, right? Regular people that don't have the perfectionist trait. And they put these two groups of people on an exercise bike and told them that they needed to, ride a certain distance in a certain amount of time. And then no matter what they rode, they would come back in and tell them, you didn't make the distance. Please try one more time. And what they found in the study is that this perfectionist group, on their second effort, their effort like went off a cliff, right?
They gave up.
They completely gave up,
Yeah.
didn't try. Whereas the second group, the people, they did a similar effort, if not tried even a little bit harder the second time to reach the benchmark. Um, and the takeaway for that, for the perfectionist lab, right, is that the people who are identified as perfectionist traits are so careful to protect themselves from failure that
Yeah.
they will tell themselves, right, this isn't possible, so I'm not even going to try. And it's not a huge leap to make the case, or to to understand why that would not be desirable in a work setting, right?
Sure.
Somebody who's so careful to protect themselves from any form of personal failure that they won't even give their best effort in an instance of something seeming like they might not be able to achieve the desired result.
Yeah, 100%. Which is suffocating to things like innovation or doing things differently when you've seen past mistakes to avoid future mistakes. Um, all these things, right? We know from playing games that often the primary ways that you get feedback about whether or not something goes well is failure, right? Oftentimes, and one thing about this episode that is tricky, Jake, is that there's lots of different types of workplaces, right? So there
Right.
are some workplaces where failure is probably less acceptable than others, right? Where is it
Like a
okay?
surgeon.
Sure. Or a pilot.
Right.
And surgeons make mistakes. We don't want them to
Right.
fail, but they'll make mistakes. Pilots make mistakes, but we don't want them to fail. I, in my work, can
But when things
afford to
start
make
going
mistakes.
bad, we don't
Yeah.
want them to not
to,
try.
to definitely not try. Yeah, definitely not. Um, but no, this completely resonates with me. And I think that one of the most important, our relationships inform our ability to do our work. I don't think that that's quasi scientific, if that's, one of the things that we most frequently get criticized for, because, right, we're
There's like
social
one
humans
person one
functioning within,
time who's criticized
yeah,
us for that.
yeah.
It's so crazy.
It was
Like
at least twice.
talk about like perfectionist
Perfectionism.
trait. Like criticism just sticks out so much.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Especially, yeah. I think we both have that trait.
I think it's like a plague, honestly. I
Yeah.
I think that our society has
Yeah.
created a vast swath of perfectionists. I think that's what they're talking about in this
Yeah.
book. Like it's a very common thing. But anyway, back to games. When I was listening to this NPR story, at the end they asked like, what can we do to not be so perfectionist all the
Mm.
time?
Yeah.
And I again, I haven't read the book. Maybe they talk about games in the book, but on the NPR story, he says, basically the biggest thing is like to teach self-acceptance, to like teach people that it's okay to fail, that we are imperfect human beings, etc. And I just wanted to scream like, we have a perfect tool to practice this, and it is play. It is, playing games. These are our own, little laboratories where we can do exactly that, right? We can uh, give ourselves safe spaces to fail. And I'm not the first person who's come up with this idea. In doing research for this presentation, I found a quote from Joan Moriarty and Jonathan Kay from their book Your Move: What Board Games Teach Us About Life, that just speaks so directly to this like perfectionist problem, which is this is the quote: the brutal reality of our lives has taught us that when we face a challenge, there are only two acceptable outcomes: succeed brilliantly on your first attempt or do not try at all. Games at their best have the power to create a special space, a world within the world, a kind of magic circle where different rules apply.
Yeah.
That's a great quote, right?
That's a great quote. Yeah. 100%.
So that's where I sort of end the presentation, where I talk about what the magic circle is. And this gets back to why games are such an incredible tool for building trust amongst people, which is, the magic circle is a unstated social contract. This is not news to you, Brendan, or many of our listeners, but and it will be to the people in this presentation, right? An unstated social contract where we agree to abide by the rules of the game without cheating. We
Yeah.
agreed to take the game seriously enough to make a sincere effort to win and not throw the game. And we basically agreed to take the game not so seriously that it will affect my relationships with the fellow players outside the game, right? Don't be a jackass.
Yeah.
And those are actually like really important and nuanced and, difficult things to ask. If we were asked, yet when we sit down to play a game, we just instantly adopt them. If
Yeah.
we were to have like a meeting of advocates or a big coalition where everybody wants, maybe you're moving in the same direction, but some people want one thing, other people are prioritizing something else, and you tried to get them to just follow all these rules instantly, it would be really difficult in many instances. So by giving people the opportunity to play and successfully complete a game, you come away from it feeling bonded in, I think, a really important and meaningful way.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's great. And then there's also probably research about taking breaks where games kind of factor directly into that too. Like I know that this is not included in your presentation, which is great because you need to get right to the core of it. But there's also something to be said, Jake, where the overlap between workplaces where you can play games and that's an okay thing to do within that space. Like you won't be asked by the leadership team to not do that activity at work, even during lunch or whatever. Like that type of space is, I'm sure there are benefits. Like there are real reasons why I think the overlap of people feeling comfortable playing games at work and people actually doing it also makes for a good workplace. That wouldn't be as direct of a comment as you could probably make in a presentation where you've laid out your case a lot more cleanly. But I feel is important to just speak to now that, like, I, as someone who really values games and cares about games, should actively seek out trying to create spaces for that in my workplace if I want my workplace to be like that and and it's fine for my job. But sorry, that's a little sidebar.
No,
Please.
and
Yeah.
that's where I want to go to next with this episode, right? To talk a little bit about our like actual experiences playing games at work and why that might work or succeed or fail. But yeah, that's where I end the presentation, and then I'm going to invite everyone to play a game. Last year, I had like 7 copies of just one,
Nice.
and
Yeah.
this year, because we're in an even bigger group, what I think I'm going to try and do is get everybody to play a massive game of Blob Party,
Okay.
like, and move around the room. That's my plan because it just
That's
feels like
awesome.
too many people to
Play just
facilitate
one.
different
Yeah.
games, like in different tables. So I think
100%.
I'm gonna try that and see. It might be a total disaster, but there'll only be like 10 minutes left anyway. So I'd be like, well, that didn't work. See you next year.
That's awesome. I don't fully remember the rules of Blob Party, but it's basically about like if you believe this or that, you go in
So
this group.
the way Blob Party works is
Yeah.
you'll say a category, maybe books, and then a
Yep.
word, maybe ship.
Okay.
And then everybody has to write down
Ah,
one thing, and then you have to find everyone you match with. And the idea is to all get into one blob by the end of the game.
got it. Got it. Got it. Got it. So in the example, what might you write down?
Odysseus, maybe.
Sure. Okay. Cool. And so you find
Or the
everyone else
Odyssey. Probably the
who wrote
Odyssey.
down the
Yeah, right?
Odyssey, and then you become a blob. You decide
Yeah.
together. Cool. No, it sounds
There's
awesome.
I'm realizing as I'm talking through this, there's some risk that everybody will get into one group except for one single person. But
Well,
I might have to roll the dice.
yeah. I think, then it becomes a guessing game of everyone trying to guess what that person's going to put.
Yeah,
That'd be fun
that's
too.
like so funny. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can also caveat, like, it says you can only play this game up to 8 people, but we're gonna try it with 85
Yeah. Nice. Yeah.
or
Love it.
whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah,
So, Jake, if people want to sort of take this sort of idea, right,
yeah.
that playing games at work is good for some of the reasons you just laid out and probably other reasons, do you actively play games at work often? And do you have advice for people who don't but would like to? Or like what types of games have worked well?
That's a great question. It's incredibly hard, in my opinion, to get. It often takes shifting the whole organizational culture, right, to
Yeah.
accept something that you know currently organizational culture has antibodies to fight against. Like, the antibodies are coding play as not productive and saying like, don't do that.
Yep.
So I think it takes like some real intentional effort to do. It's something I've tried to get going at my workplace now. And I would say to middling success, I'll occasionally get people to play games with me over lunch. Some of the big challenges with it, frankly, are the fact that we are a hybrid culture workplace. So we can work at home or in the office, meaning if I'm in the office, I won't it won't be that I always have like a core group of people that I always play with because we'll
Sure.
all be on different schedules and people's schedules move around so much.
Yep.
Um, so I think if you are working in the office, then that would be a first step, right? Try and identify just two or three other or one other like-minded people and see if you can start implementing games like over the lunch hour. I think that's a good way to start off because typically if you have a lunch break, that's your time to do with it
Yeah.
as you please, and games can work great to play and eat at the same time. I think ultimately, like ideally, we're getting to a place where you can find opportunities to play beyond just your personal time. Um, and I think a good way, again, I mentioned before, is to you could kind of replace or sometimes substitute warm welcomes in meetings with a quick game, a round of a game. That's one
Yeah.
thing that my team at work has started doing. We used to do to start all our team meetings. We do like a bi-weekly team meeting, and we used to have a standing item on our agenda to share good news because there's often a lot of bad news in the world. So people would kind of go around and find a good news story. That started feeling a little bit like homework to folks, um, which is a sad state of affairs. It's like difficult to find the good news stories. So what we did was we switched it. So now we have a standing item that's good news or game, and whoever is the facilitator of the meeting, which rotates around, gets to essentially pick. And I've been really happy that it's almost always games at this point. It seems like that's giving our meeting more of what we wanted out of that kind of uplift to get started than the good news was. So that's been a really successful way it's been implemented.
Nice. I think during retreats is also, if you're in a workspace where people go on retreats, which is sort of another interesting thing that is like within the social contract of what we do at work, we're going to take a day where we just don't actively do our jobs, but talk more sort of like strategically high level and professional development focused on how we can be better at doing our jobs, or maybe focusing on some other element just based on how your retreat is structured. But I found that games at retreats are something that a lot of workplaces can be amenable to. In all the times I can think of that I've played games at work, not during a lunch hour, it has been because of a retreat.
Yeah,
And those games often, I find the sort of games where people are guessing things, right? So the opportunities to iteratively fail together out loud tend to be the ones that bubble to the top. So, for example, I had a retreat recently where the whole game was someone had printed out all these words that are just spelled wrong, but if you read them phonetically, and if you just kind of keep reading them phonetically and squint and other people say what they think, you can figure out what it means, which sounds not, as listeners, you're probably like, what is Brendan talking about? But that's kind of the game. And then you just do it 3 times and then you're like, oh, interesting. And I found that to be a really fun social experience at a relatively, for me, a relatively new workplace where one, it was safe to fail. Two, I saw the benefit. We were all sharing in the benefits of other people's ideas, even if those ideas weren't exactly right. It helped get to the right idea, which I think is really validating a workplace, right? That all ideas have value, because they're going to help us get to the destination, and
right.
also
It's like
demonstrating that this workplace cares about not necessarily who gets us there, but the communal act of getting there.
right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Totally. It's uh it's the idea that, not all ideas are right, but even wrong ideas are
have
often
value.
close to a good idea, right?
Yeah,
It's like adjacent to a good idea.
totally.
You
Yeah,
can leapfrog off it. That's cool. I think retreats can run into the challenge of being like mandated fun.
sure. Yeah,
There's definitely a strong contingent of people that I've worked with that don't like retreats, and I think a lot of it's like for that reason, right?
yeah.
I haven't had that problem because I just like love playing games and doing fun, silly stuff so much. But I think you have to be careful with that, right? And I think it can also like potentially do harm to the idea that like games are this like fun, uplifting thing that we can be doing in the workplace. If the only time people are experiencing them, they're being told they have to do it.
This is a relaxing, fun break. Yeah. Have you
Yeah,
ever done an escape room through work?
I haven't.
Okay, I have. And I will say, for me, I love escape rooms, right? Because I love games. I find escape rooms are games plus puzzles really fun. It was great, except I will say we had some achievement players who I think ruined their experience when they didn't win and ruined everyone else's experience when they didn't win, right? Where you sort of see like, oh, right, not everyone plays games often and understands that it's better for everyone if we don't necessarily care about winning.
Right.
Which is
Escape rooms are tough because it's so framed around like, are you gonna
are you going
win
to
or not?
win? Yeah, this is true. Okay, that's fair, Jake. But I will say that was another really fun exercise because of all the reasons we've talked about, right? It's so interesting that we kind of keep going back to trust and the opportunity to fail, communication. Escape rooms are key for that, right? Where you're often given more tasks than you can complete on your own. So what becomes the most important is communicating vital information, but identifying what vital information is too, which can be tricky. And I think that's true of work also. You don't always know what the important information is. I don't know. I would love
Yeah.
to play more escape rooms at work or
The
just
cool
more
thing
escape
about
rooms.
escape rooms can be I've done a couple of them outside of work, like for fun, and it's kind of like I guess trivia is sort of my comparison or whatever, where some of the puzzles are maybe better suited to the way one person is like looking at the problem or can look at the
Sure.
problem. Right. That was my experience where like when I did escape room, I found the answer to a couple of the puzzles and people were like, "Wow." And then, but the rest of them, I had absolutely no clue, and other people were figuring out. And I was like, "Whoa, how did your brain do like put that together like that? I never would have got there."
Yeah,
So
totally.
that's cool too, right? Different ways of looking at a problem
Yep.
being beneficial.
Do you have recommendations for games at work?
Yeah, there's not going to be groundbreaking stuff here. I think, treat it like in most situations, right? The simpler, the better, And
Yeah,
I think that's something that a lot of us have gleaned as we, you know, the podcast listener, the decision space cohort are probably the enthusiastic gamers in most of our social circles. So when you're introducing anybody new to the board game hobby, it's usually best to start out really simple. And I think that's doubly true at work because I think there are I don't want to scare people away from like trying to create change in their workplace and implement this because I do think there's strong benefits to it. But you don't want people to be like, I feel too dumb to do
yeah,
this, right?
yep,
Um, so games that have mass market appeal can be really great too. A game that's worked well for me at work is Blockus, which is a fun game and it has basically no rule set, and it looks like you know the type of
approachable.
game that people maybe are used to. I don't think I wouldn't like say like play Uno if you don't particularly like Uno. I think it's still important that you're enjoying what you're doing too, because you'll probably be the person that needs to be kind of pitching and selling it to the group. So really simple, really low complexity is definitely where I would start. Other ones that have been really successful and for a quick lunch break is Lost Cities. I have one colleague who has become my Lost Cities buddy, and he'll occasionally ask if he's like, Jake, are you in the office? And I know that he wants to play Lost Cities at lunch. That if he's reaching out to me,
That's awesome.
so that one has been great. Just personally, and you only have to find a single person, and you're good with that. I just recently had a game lunch where we played Cockroach Poker and Deep Sea Adventure. Of the two, Deep Sea Adventure was the surprise hit. People loved that, and were like, taking pictures of the box to go pick it up for themselves. That's a really simple roll and move game, which I think also right speaks to sort of like things that kind of call back to the mass market type of stuff, mechanisms that people are already familiar with going into the game can be really beneficial.
Totally.
Um,
Would you ever try playing the Resistance at work?
yeah, I don't think so. I mean,
Okay.
it would take a really
Special group.
special situation. I was kind of tempted to because I
Yeah.
think it's so fun and so evocative and quite simple, but there is some inherent risk here, right? Where people when things go well, people are going to come away from it feeling better, feeling healthier, literally, and having closer connections with the people at their workplace. So introducing a game where you're like lying to each other does feel a little bit fraught, especially
Yeah.
like right at the jump. I guess cockroach poker, you're lying to each other too, but the stakes feel a lot lower there, and that's just like dumb fun. But
Yeah.
even in that one, the person who lost was like seemed kind of bummed.
Yeah. Oh. I was gonna say, I think this is, I asked the question, but the ultimate answer is the one you provided, which is that the best game to play is whatever game fits within the constraints of time you have, and is a game that everyone involved is interested in.
Yeah,
And that's going to be totally different for any given workplace, any given pair of people. And I don't know. I could see just classic playing card games working really well and being a nice bridge. Most people have played games with classic cards and enjoy them. So just saying, playing spades at lunch could be a nice way to bridge into, oh, I've played these other trick taking games. Do you want to try this 2-player only trick taking game that I know called The Fox in the Forest? And then, maybe
yeah,
you can bridge that
totally.
way. Yeah.
I will say too, I've added 3 games to our like resource library at work. We have like a book nook that now
Okay.
has 3 games in
What
it.
3 games did you add?
Just one,
Great.
So Clover and Blob Party, because
Okay.
and those are
Cool.
special games, I think, because they are like the perfect icebreaker game,
Yeah.
right? So, the idea, and I don't know that anybody has done this, but like my idea with adding there is that like somebody could come grab that game to start their meeting with like a quick round of just one in place of icebreaker. I've done that at meetings that, I've led, but I'm not sure that like I've yet got full like uptake. And then the last thing I want to say too about playing games at work is you have to have leadership on board, right? And that's just the
100%. Yeah.
reality of the world where I don't want anybody listening to this to get in trouble at work. So go to your supervisor, go as high up the chain as you can, and try and get buy-in, because like without somebody who's more senior at an organization buying in, it's going to be really, really hard for anybody to feel like it's okay to do that, especially like outside of just in the lunchroom or whatever. Like I feel like, at least for me, that never felt too stressful, but to play a game at any other time of the day, I would feel, you know, weird still.
Yeah.
But I'm lucky that my boss is like, I've talked to him about this, and it's like part of my like professional development plans, like try and like get more people to play games at work. It's like literally part of my job
Nice. That's
now,
awesome.
which is really cool.
That's
And
really
and I've
cool. It's in
and I've
writing.
yeah, right. And I've talked to and I'm like not a senior level employee. Had the opportunity to go to one of the executive team meetings, and I basically pitched my games at work. I was like, I'm always playing games at lunch. It would really mean a ton, to me, and I think would give people more permission to play
Yeah.
games and like do this, because they'll like say like that makes sense. Yeah, we should be playing games. But it's one thing to like say that, and another thing to be like, oh man, there's the CEO playing games
Yeah.
at that table
100%.
at 2 p.m. or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, you
Would
gotta
you
kind
try
of.
the mind?
I think the mind is a great one. Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Cool.
or Wilmot's Warehouse or something like that. Yeah,
Yeah. Cool.
simple stuff. That's pretty much it. That's my spiel for play at work. How do you feel at the end of this conversation, Brendan?
I feel so I think that you're fighting the good fight, Jake. I want to work in a workspace where I can play more games, and I want playing games to be more normal at work.
Tell me about your workplace, like, because I guess I didn't ask you as many questions
It's
because I
weird.
know that you told me up front. This is behind the scenes that
Yeah.
you're like, I'm down to do the episode, but just to be upfront, I've never played games at work.
Well, see, I said that, but then I talked about, doing escape room, this other game that I started a retreat with.
Yeah,
It's definitely there, but I think that it's not as explicit maybe in some ways. There's so many sort of almost hidden games that people have found ways to sneak into their work lives or the work lives of other people. I have played solo games at work before. Oftentimes when I was testing variants of my own games, I would just over lunch play one of my games because it was a nice way to sneak in things during lunchtime. But I don't think I've ever, in a meeting, started a meeting off by playing a social game like Just One or something like that. And I think that would be awesome. Just One's the perfect game to start a meeting with, especially. And there's ways to sort of ease into it. So I think that's my resolution for the year.
Yeah.
And then it's tough because I think I have a hard time taking breaks in the way that I should at work. I tend to
Yeah.
get really focused and then just like dedicate all of my time while I'm at work to working, more than I should. I need to be better about taking lunch breaks.
Yeah.
And that's a requisite. That's a different issue. And I think I recently have discovered I met someone at work who also really loves games, and we were playing the game where he would mention a game and then I would just know it. And that was a fun party trick within the context of work. Where he's like, how do you know all of these games? And then I got into it very briefly. And I think that at some point I would love to maybe see if he'd be interested in playing games, but
Yeah.
I'm fairly new in my workplace too. So that's,
Totally.
I think, another element where it's just like, this feels somewhat transgressive
there's
in a
just
way I
like
wish it didn't, but it
there's just the
does.
regular like social fear of rejection where
There's
like you're like,
that
hey,
too, for
I
sure.
brought this game. Do you want to play it with me? And they're like, no.
Yeah,
Or I
yeah.
can't. And you're like, oh no,
Yeah.
that's horrible.
Yeah,
Now I
totally.
don't. Yeah. So it's scary. I felt
Yeah.
that too. And like, there's a big, I think easing into it's great. Like
Yeah.
trying to get somebody to play a game over like a shared lunch break, maybe like
Yeah.
step 1, step 2, hey, we can use this instead of an icebreaker. Step 3 is like, I need a 15-minute break. I'm going to go see if, like maybe somebody will take 15 minutes to like decompress with like a quick round of Fox and Forest. I haven't even got there
Oh,
yet because that's like asking somebody to take time out of like their work
yeah.
time for like an impromptu game. That's like, that's where we're going. That's where we need to get to do our best work. But I'm not there yet either.
So there are puzzles. There's Ravensburger puzzles set up in the lunchroom at my workplace. So there's a table just dedicated to a puzzle. Very,
Just
same
wipe
company.
that.
So I feel like step 4 is we and I work in the same workplace. We set Barrage
Yeah.
up on a table.
Decision space games and entertainment.
Yeah, you check in and you take your turn and then you come back to it later. That's the dream. But yeah, Jake,
that's just us playing async on Board Game Arena all the time while we're working, but like in person.
exactly. It's tactile. Jake, I hope your presentation goes really well, and I hope
Thanks.
that the blob is complete and that there's not one little amorphous blob floating on.
That would be brutal, right?
Yeah, but that's okay. Unless it's you. Maybe you could be the soul blobless one.
That would be good. Okay, cool. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the episode. This is a bit of a weird one. I'm really curious to hear about everybody's experience playing games at work. Do you play games now? How does that go for you? Are you going to try? Would you like to? Please talk to us in our Discord.
Yeah. Also, coming up, we're probably going to cover games like, I'm going to say them and I'm going to watch Jake's reaction, which if you're a patron, you can also gauge and then know if these will really come true. Burgle Bros. Jake was pure pain. Mexica. Yeah, okay, so that's a Mass Trilogy game. We're definitely covering Mexica coming up. So there's just 2 games coming up on the horizon, most likely. We don't talk about co-op games that much, so I think Burgle Bros will be a really interesting conversation, even if it's not a game you're all that interested in, because the decision space is mostly above the table. We didn't even talk about co-op games at work. Maybe that would have been interesting. Work is a co-op game. Not really.
Just One's co-op.
That's true. And then Mexica, I don't know. Mexica is just amazing. In 2025, after we cover Mexica, we're just going to become the Kramer and Kiesling podcast, right? Like we'll just talk about K&K games. The transformation will be complete. No more Knizia. Okay. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. If you made it to this part of the episode, please leave a review if you haven't. We'd love to hear your thoughts, and we'll read your review out on the show. Thank you to Hembry for our intro and outro song, Reach Out. And come talk to us in our Discord. There's a link in our show notes and on DecisionSpacePodcast.com. Until next time, bye y'all.
Bye y'all.